My name is Julian. For the past 12 years, I worked as an independent investigative journalist, covering municipal corruption, dark money campaigns, and real estate fraud in Western Pennsylvania. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that the truth isn't something hidden under a rock. It's something buried under layers of premium corporate payrolls, non-disclosure agreements, and heavily redacted police reports. You learn to read between the lines of city council minutes, and you learn to notice when people vanish from the public record without a trace. But nothing in my years of tracking stolen city funds, corporate land grabs, or rigged local elections could prepare me for the absolute, calculated malice I uncovered at the Blackwood Reclamation Facility, a historic, state-owned auction house sitting on the bleak industrial outskirts of the local county lines. To the general public and the casual antique collector, the Blackwood facility was just a standard county repository. It was a place where the local government liquidated foreclosed industrial properties, seized assets from tax evasion cases, and sold off cheap historical junk from abandoned pioneer estates. It was a massive, sprawling brick structure built during the height of the steel boom, featuring long, echoing corridors, damp subterranean basements, and high, arched Victorian windows that looked out over the gray, dead winter hills. But in the late winter of 2024, this public facility became the epicenter of a media blackout that didn't make any statistical sense. 6 months prior to my arrival, the sprawling Victorian-era residential brick estate attached to the back of the auction house had been the scene of what the local police ledger initially classified as a tragic domestic vagrancy incident. 7 college-age transients who had been squatting on the property vanished overnight, leaving behind all their clothes, their sleeping bags, and their personal identifications. A week later, their remains were discovered inside a sealed, forgotten subterranean concrete vault directly beneath Room 9, the estate's private wood-paneled historical library. The local coroner's report was heavily redacted under state security exemptions, but whispers from the first responders who initially broke the seal painted a picture of absolute, ritualistic slaughter. The bodies hadn't been mutilated by conventional weapons. They had been structurally altered, their cells seemingly liquefied and fused to the stone floor. Yet, within 48 hours of discovery, the regional police chief ordered the entire investigation permanently closed. The case files were stamped classified, the forensic teams were replaced by private contractors, and the entire property was rushed to a low-profile private auction with a starting bid so absurdly low it looked like a clerical error, driven by an anonymous encrypted tip on my secure shortwave radio network. I checked into a rotting motel across the state highway and spent 3 grueling weeks tracking the hidden ownership history of the Blackwood estate. The corporate paper trail didn't lead to a local real estate developer or an industrial salvage company. It led straight through a labyrinth of shell corporations directly to the private doorstep of Julian Vance Jr., the eldest son of the state's most powerful corporate lobbyist and political kingmaker. The names matching the signatures on the deeds tied back to the same political dynasty that funded the private security apparatus of the state. I knew that if I want to catch the physical blueprint of this cover-up, I had to get inside Room 9 before the upcoming liquidation auction stripped the house bare and scattered the evidence to the winds. On a freezing, rain-slick Tuesday evening, as a massive winter storm rolled over the county, I paid off a disgruntled nighttime security guard named Thomas, a man whose trembling hands, sweat-stained collar, and constant, terrified glances over his shoulder told me he'd seen exactly what was left behind in that room. He swiped me through the side maintenance entrance of the brick facility, his voice dropping to a panicked, hurried whisper under the dim, high-frequency buzz of the flickering halogen corridor lights. "You have exactly 2 hours until the shift supervisor returns from the county patrol route, Julian," Thomas muttered, his fingers nervously spinning his master keyring as he refused to meet my eyes. "Whatever you do not touch the inventory tagged in black plastic sheets. Don't look at them, don't catalog them. And if the temperature drops suddenly and you start smelling dry wood ash, you drop your camera and you get the hell out of this building." The internal architectural layout of the Blackwood estate was massive, confusing, and suffocating. The air carried a thick, ancient stench of dry rot, damp concrete and oxidized copper. As I climbed the grand, creaking oak staircase toward a residential wing, the heavy silence of the building felt physical, almost claustrophobic, completely swallowing the sound of my heavy leather boots. Every long hallway was lined with tagged furniture from dead estates. Sheeted mirrors, heavy mahogany wardrobes, grandfather clocks that had stopped ticking decades ago, and boxes of antique porcelain dolls staring out from the shadows like silent, unblinking witnesses to a crime. At the very end of the northern corridor sat the heavy timbered door to room 9. The original brass plaque had been violently pried off the wood with a crowbar, leaving only a scarred, splintered outline on the dark surface. I pushed the heavy door open, my flashlight beam cutting through a layer of ancient, undisturbed dust. I stepped into the massive, 2-story private library. The moment my feet crossed the threshold, the ambient temperature dropped instantly, freezing the breath of my lungs in sharp, white plumes. I shined my tactical flashlight across the room. The grand floor-to-ceiling bookshelves had been completely stripped of their literature, leaving yawning, empty shadows along the perimeter walls like open tombs. In the direct center of the bare hardwood floor sat a large, perfect circle about 10 feet wide, where the dark oak had been chemically burned and stained a deep, oily charcoal color. I approached the circle, crouching down on my knees to inspect a grain of the wood. The floorboards weren't just scorched by fire. They were deeply scarred with hundreds of uniform, circular indentations, each exactly 2 inches wide, arranged in a massive, mathematically precise geometric matrix that twisted toward the center. Suddenly, the heavy oak door behind me slammed shut with a deafening thud that echoed to the empty library walls. The heavy iron deadbolt slid into place with a mechanical, metallic snap that didn't require a human hand to turn. A cold jolt of panic flared in my chest. I lunged backward, grabbing the heavy iron handle, twisting it violently until my knuckles bruised, but the locking mechanism was entirely frozen, solid as concrete, and that was the exact second the ambient sound of the freezing rain against the high, arched windows ceased entirely. The world outside the room went dead silent, replaced by a low, deep, vibrating sub-bass hum that seemed to resonate directly out of floorboards beneath the burned circle. It was a frequency so low it vibrated the bones in my chest, making my vision blur. Through the darkness, the air in the center of the library began to warp, rippling and bending like a thick thermal heat wave rising off hot asphalt. A thick, suffocating cloud of dark gray smoke, carrying the violent, acrid scent of dry wood ash, ozone, and scorched human hair, began to slowly pour out of cold fireplace vents, pooling heavily across the floor. And within the center of that thick smoke, a pale, green pulsating light bloomed from absolute nowhere. It expanded and contracted in a perfectly rhythmic mechanical cadence, matching the slow rise and fall of the machine. Underneath the low vibration of the room, I heard a sound that made my blood run instantly cold. It wasn't the sound of a traditional spirit or a typical haunting. It was a high-pitched analog mechanical wailing, rising and falling like an old air raid siren, bleeding directly out of the dead electrical outlets and stripped wiring along the baseboards. It was a clinical, automated sound of danger. I backed away toward the furthest corner of the room, my tactical flashlight beam shaking violently as I shined it into the swirling ash cloud. Out of the empty space above the charcoal circle, 7 distinct, shadowy forms began to slowly materialize within the green light. They weren't whole human figures. They were the translucent, fractured shapes of the 7 young transients who had vanished 6 months ago. Their bodies were shifting like digital artifacts, their mouths wide open and silent, agonizing screams. Their spectral hands desperately clawed at their own throats as if they were drowning in the very air they breathed. But they weren't looking at me. Their terrified, glowing eyes were all locked onto a single object remaining in the far corner of the library, a massive, 7-foot-tall antique obsidian mirror frame draped in heavy black plastic sheets. From beneath the plastic drape, a thick, sticky gray liquid began to slowly ooze out onto the floorboards, sizzling and hissing with intense radiant heat the moment it met the wood, burning deep grooves into the floor. As the fluid touched the outer edge of the burned circle, The green light pulsed with blinding intensity, and the shape of a massive, broad-shouldered humanoid entity began to warp the air directly in front of the draped mirror. It had no face, no distinct human features, but on its brow, 3 brilliant glowing dots arranged in a perfect upward triangle flared into existence. The air raid siren sound reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating the fillings of my teeth and threatening to burst my eardrums. Driven by pure, primal, instinctual survival terror, I didn't try to document the entities with my camera. I grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the stone hearth and violently smashed it against the reinforced lock of the library door. Crack, crack, the ancient timber splintered under force. I threw my entire body weight against the frame, breaking the deadbolt mechanism, and tumbled out into the cold corridor just as a massive wave of intense, dry heat blasted out of room 9 behind me. The very instant my boots hit the linoleum of the public hallway, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered sharply and stabilized into a brilliant white glow. The natural silence of the winter storm returned, the rain pattering against the roof, and the mechanical air raid siren instantly vanished as if someone had flipped a master isolation switch. I scrambled to my feet, my lungs burning from the ash, not stopping my sprint until I burst through the main security exit into the freezing night air. Thomas was gone from the security post, his guard shack completely abandoned, the door swinging open in the wind. I ran back to my vehicle, my hand shaking so violently I could barely turn the ignition key to start the engine. Before I fled the county lines of good, I parked in the shadow of an abandoned gas station and managed to access the facility's digital manifest terminal through a pre-installed backdoor on my laptop. I pulled the final shipping order for the items tagged in room 9. The massive, draped antique mirror had already been cleared for transport by a private freight carrier. It hadn't been destroyed by the state, and it hadn't been locked away in a police evidence locker. It had been sold hours before the public auction even began to a young, unsuspecting couple who had recently purchased a historic home in the isolated valleys of western Maryland. At the bottom of the digital invoice, marked under the official corporate seal of the Vanguard Horizons Group, was a short, handwritten logistics note from Julian Vance Jr. himself. The vessel has been calibrated in room 9. The baseline genetic scrub of the squatters is complete. Ship the mirror to the Maryland perimeter for Phase 2 integration immediately. Monitor the buyers for cellular and neurological decay. The grid must expand. I closed my laptop, the screen reflecting the sheer terror etched into my face, and stared out through the rain-soaked windshield of the dark, distant ridge of the mountains. I knew then that the slaughter at the auction house wasn't an isolated crime of passion or political corruption. It was the ignition point for something much larger, anomalous. Weaponized hardware was being systematically shipped directly into the homes of unsuspecting American citizens, and the countdown to the total closure of the perimeter had already begun. My name is Sarah. If Julian was the one tracking the bloodline of the corporate cover-up from the auction house, my husband David and I were the ones who unwittingly invited the weaponized aftermath into our home. In the winter of 2024, we thought we had achieved the ultimate American dream. We had just purchased a beautiful, secluded historic colonial home nestled in the dense, forested valleys of western Maryland. The house sat at the dead end of Gravel Ridge Road, completely cut off from the noise of the suburbs, surrounded by acres of thick oak and mountain laurel trees. We wanted a sanctuary, a quiet place where David could focus on his architectural design work, and I could work on my freelance photography. We had very little money left after the down payment, so we spent our weekends hunting through local estate sales and online liquidation portals to furnish the empty rooms. In late February, David stumbled across a digital listing from the Blackwood Reclamation Facility in Pennsylvania. They were auctioning off high-end historical pieces from a prominent estate at prices that seemed criminally low. Among the inventory was a massive 7-foot-tall antique mirror. The frame was crafted from a heavy, polished black stone that the listing described as obsidian, carved with elaborate, tight geometric patterns that twisted around the borders. It looked majestic, powerful, and completely unique. We placed a minimum bid, fully expecting to be outbid by wealthy antique dealers. To our absolute shock, we won the item instantly. The confirmation email didn't even come from the auction house. It was processed through a private logistics firm under a corporate header that read Vanguard Horizons Group. 2 days later, a plain, unmarked white freight truck delivered the mirror to our Ridge Road property. The delivery drivers didn't behave like standard couriers. They were tight-lipped, muscular men wearing matching dark gray canvas work uniforms. They refused to make eye contact, handled the mirror with a cold, militaristic precision, and insisted on bolting the heavy stone frame directly into the stud walls of our second-floor master bedroom. When they tore away the thick, black plastic protective sheeting, the mirror took our breath away. The glass wasn't standard silver glass. It had a deep, dark, smoke-like tint to it, reflecting the room with a strange, high-contrast clarity. But the most peculiar detail was the frame itself. Carved deep into the polished obsidian stone, perfectly spaced along the top border, were hundreds of tiny, uniform circular indentations. Each circle was exactly 2 inches wide, matching the geometric matrix Julian had discovered on the scarred floors of Room 9. The first few days, the mirror was simply a stunning conversation piece. But within a week of its installation, the physical atmosphere inside our historic home began to undergo a subtle, terrifying shift. It started with the ambient temperature. Our central heating system was brand new, yet the master bedroom remained perpetually, unnaturally freezing. No matter how high David cranked the thermostat, our breath would consistently bloom into white plumes the moment we stepped within 10 feet of the obsidian frame. But the true horror began with our dog, a golden retriever named Buster. Buster had slept at the foot of our bed since he was a puppy. But the night the mirror arrived, he refused to cross the threshold of the bedroom. He would stand out in the dimly lit hallway, his hackles raised, his tail straight down, letting out a low, continuous, mournful whimper as he stared directly into dark, smoky glass. By the second week, the physical symptoms manifested. David began complaining of persistent, high-frequency ringing in his ears that wouldn't cease, accompanied by severe, sudden migraines that left him disoriented. When I developed my film rolls or looked at the digital photographs I took inside the bedroom, the images were completely ruined. They didn't show normal motion blur. The frames were covered in violent digital artifacts, chromatic aberrations, and heavy tracking lines, looking exactly like a scrambled VHS tape from the late 1990s. Then came the midnight disruptions. Every single morning, precisely at 3 a.m., David and I would be jolted awake by a sudden, violent sensation of claustrophobia. The electronic alarm clocks on our nightstands didn't just flicker. Their red LED digits would begin rolling backward at an impossible, chaotic speed, unraveling time before freezing completely into solid blocks of static light. And in the absolute silence of the rural Maryland Valley, a sound would begin to bleed directly out of our home's electrical baseboards. It was a low, distant mechanical wailing, a rising and falling cadence that sounded exactly like a retro air raid siren operating on a dead frequency. On the night of March 12th, the storm outside hit its peak, burying the valley in freezing rain and heavy wind. At exactly 3 a.m., the main electrical grid of the house snapped. The lights died, plunging the bedroom into pitch darkness. The air raid siren sound from the walls instantly grew deafeningly loud, vibrating the window panes and causing the plaster on the ceiling to crack. I reached for my tactical flashlight on the nightstand, clicked the metal switch, and aimed the beam toward the far wall where the obsidian mirror sat. The moment the light hit the dark, smoky glass, my heart stopped. The mirror wasn't reflecting our bedroom anymore. Through the lens of dark glass, it showed a completely different space, a raw, subterranean concrete vault lined with pulsing high-voltage cables and electronic monitoring decks. And standing directly in the center of that concrete cell were 7 translucent, shadowy human forms, their faces twisted into silent, agonizing screams as they clawed desperately at their own throats. "David, wake up. Look at the glass." I shrieked, violently shaking his shoulder. But David didn't move. He was sitting straight up in bed, his eyes wide open, bloodshot, and completely glassy. He wasn't looking at the mirror. He was staring blankly at the ceiling, his jaw locked in a rigid line. He was completely catatonic, unresponsive to my voice, his skin covered in a layer of cold, oily sweat that smelled violently of industrial plastics and burning synthetic polymers. Suddenly, a thick, suffocating cloud of dark gray smoke, smelling distinctly of dry wood ash and ozone, began to pour directly out of the seams of the obsidian frame, pooling heavily over our bedsheets. The air in the bedroom began to warp and bend violently, rippling like a massive thermal heat wave. And within the center of the dark smoke, right in front of the mirror, the physical air shaped itself into a massive, 7-foot-tall, broad-shouldered humanoid entity. It had no face, no distinct features, but on its brow, 3 brilliant glowing dots arranged in a perfect upward triangle flared into a blinding green pulsation. The entity stepped forward, its feet leaving no depression on the mattress, but a wave of intense, localized radiant heat blasted toward us. The moment its invisible, translucent hand passed over the foot of the bed, a terrifying phenomenon occurred. Spontaneous combustion. The heavy cotton blankets, the wooden headboard, and the structural carpet underneath the frame instantly burst into violent, crackling flames. It wasn't a normal chemical fire. The flames burned with a dull, sickly green hue, consuming the fabrics with impossible speed without emitting a single plume of traditional black smoke. "David, run." I screamed, using every ounce of my physical strength to drag his stiff, heavy body out of the mattress as the green fire spread across the room. The heat was blistering, burning clean through my nightshirt and leaving a stinging, agonizing chemical sensation across my arms. Buster was howling frantically from the end of the hallway. Driven by pure, primal survival instinct, I hauled David out of the bedroom, tumbling down the creaking wooden staircase just as the entire second floor of our dream home was completely engulfed in that unnatural green inferno. We burst through the front door into the freezing, rain-slick yard, collapsing onto the wet gravel driveway. We watched in absolute, helpless horror as the historic colonial house burned to the ground within minutes. The green flames rose high into the winter canopy, completely unaffected by the torrential downpour of the storm. By the time the rural volunteer fire department arrived at dawn, the house was nothing but a smoking pit of white ash and twisted structural steel. The fire marshal spent hours inspecting the ruins, his face tight with confusion. He couldn't find a trace of accelerant, nor could he explain how a residential fire could burn hot enough to completely liquefy the concrete foundations of the basement. The official report simply blamed the disaster on a faulty, unmaintained historical electrical wiring system. But as David and I sat in the back of the county ambulance, wrapped in emergency blankets, I looked across the smoking ruins toward the spot where our bedroom wall had stood. There, sitting perfectly intact amidst the white ash, untouched by the fire, stood the massive obsidian mirror frame. The glass was entirely uncracked, reflecting the gray morning sky with a terrifying, smoky clarity. 2 men in dark, tailored suits, men who hadn't arrived with the fire trucks or police, were already standing by the ruins. They had brought a flatbed utility truck, equipped with a heavy hydraulic hoist. They quietly lifted the pristine obsidian mirror onto the back of the vehicle, strapped it down under heavy black plastic sheeting, and drove away toward the state line, without speaking a single word to the local authorities. It was in that exact moment that the true scale of the nightmare clicked into place. David's neurological scans at the county hospital later that week showed uniform cellular death perfectly mimicking aggressive, rapid-onset dementia, the exact same condition Marcus had treated in New York. The mirror wasn't a piece of furniture. It was a mobile, high-frequency calibration terminal. The Vanguard Horizons group was systematically placing these spatial nodes inside residential homes to test the biological tolerance of the citizens, using our lives as baseline filters before the handlers moved the operation deeper into the wild. We lost our home, We lost our security, and David's mind was permanently scarred by the frequency. But we refused to be scrubbed from the record. I kept my field notes. I kept the digital metadata from the ruined photos. And we're sending this out to the network. Because if you buy an antique piece and the air around it starts to taste like battery acid, the perimeter has already closed around you. My name is Robert. For the past 15 years, I worked as a senior wilderness ranger and search and rescue tracker for the United States Forest Service, stationed in an exceptionally isolated mountain sector of western Maryland, stretching right along the state line. If the records Julian uncovered at the auction house exposed a financial paper trail, and if Sarah's ruined home in the valley demonstrated the weaponized deployment of the hardware, then my logbooks hold the final physical proof of where these anomalies are being anchored. In my line of work, you become intimately familiar with the natural order of things. You learn the behavioral patterns of the local wildlife. You know how weather fronts move across the ridges, and you understand the exact, predictable geography of the deep timberlands. But in the early winter of 2025, the natural order of my forest was completely dismantled by a corporate perimeter. The crisis began on a freezing, overcast Tuesday morning, just as a historic winter storm front was locking down the Appalachian ridgelines. Our ranger station received an emergency dispatch regarding a missing child, a 7-year-old local boy named Samuel who had vanished from a state park campground flanking the outer boundary of the national forest. Standard search and rescue protocols dictate that a healthy child lost in these woods will leave a clear, trackable physical trail. They leave behind broken pine twigs, footprints in the mud or snow, or fabric threads from their jackets caught on the heavy mountain laurel brush. But Samuel's disappearance defied every law of tracking I had ever practiced in the field. He had vanished while standing less than 10 yards away from his parents' campsite, stepping behind a single massive oak tree to gather dry firewood. The search hounds we brought in, highly trained bloodhounds capable of tracking a scent through torrential rain, behaved completely erratically the moment they approached the radius of that oak tree. They didn't pick up a biological trail. Instead, their tails went dead straight, their hackles raised in raw terror, and they let out low, continuous, mournful whimpers before completely shutting down, refusing to move an inch forward into the deep brush. Driven by a quiet, professional determination to find the boy before the sub-zero night temperatures set in, I strapped on my heavy winter gear, packed a high-intensity tactical maglite, 2 thermal imaging cameras, 3 blank logbooks, and struck out alone into the unmapped timberlands beyond the state boundary line. By the time I hiked 3 miles past the last official public trail marker, the atmospheric conditions inside the old-growth pines underwent an unsettling, rapid transformation. A massive, suffocating cloud of dark gray fog rolled down from the upper ridges. It wasn't a natural mountain mist. It was incredibly dense, heavy, and carried a strange, oily metallic weight to it that seemed to completely deaden the ambient sounds of the wilderness. The natural crunch of the pine needles beneath my snowshoes suddenly dropped into a dead, unnatural silence. There were no birds calling in a high canopy, no small game rustling in the frozen brush, no wind whistling through the peaks. The forest felt entirely dead, frozen in perpetual, claustrophobic twilight. As I shined my flashlight through the heavy fog, the air began to carry a sharp, acrid chemical odor, a scent that smelled violently of industrial plastics, ozone, and burning synthetic polymers. It was the exact, distinct odor Sarah described during the destruction of her home. Around 4:30 p.m., as the final daylight began to dissolve into night, my thermal imaging camera began to register massive, erratic spikes of localized heat signature along the ridge. I climbed down into a deep, narrow sandstone gorge where a natural mountain spring flowed over frozen rocks. in the direct center of the snowy clearing, next to a massive, ancient fallen cedar tree. I spotted something that made my chest tighten until I could barely draw a breath. It was a perfectly smooth, uniform cylinder hole running vertically straight down into the bedrock of the forest floor, exactly 2 feet in diameter. It looked as if it had been bored into the stone with mathematical, industrial precision. I approached the opening, my hands trembling against my cold weather gear as I shined my flashlight down the shaft. The interior walls of the hole weren't rough stone. They were perfectly smooth, glazed over like melted glass, and bubbling slowly out of the mouth of the cavern was a thick, sticky gray liquid that sizzled and hissed with intense radiant heat the moment it came into contact with the frozen snow. The fluid was burning deep, grooved matrices in the surrounding earth, radiating a wave of pure heat that instantly melted the ice on my jacket. Leaning directly against the baseboard of the fallen cedar tree, right beside this chemical anomaly, was a massive, 7-foot-tall, antique obsidian stone frame. It was the exact mirror Sarah had seen the suits hoist away from the ruins of her home. The smoky glass was completely uncracked, pulsing with faint, pale green light from within the depth of its reflections. Suddenly, a sound bled directly out of the hollow cavern mouth beneath my feet, a high-pitched, mechanical wailing that rose and fell in a terrifying, rhythmic cadence. It filled the narrow sandstone gorge, vibrating the mountain bedrock. It was the exact automated air raid siren Alan Marcus and Ethan had recorded across decades of encounters. From the dark timber surrounding the clearing, a series of loud, heavy, rhythmic thwacking sound began to echo through the trees. It sounded like massive wooden clubs being slammed repeatedly against the ancient trunks. Thwack, thwack, thwack. 6 perfectly timed breaks every few seconds, moving to the canopy with an impossible, effortless velocity. Samuel. I roared into the fog, drawing my service weapon as pure. Primal survival panic flared in my chest. Through the lens of my thermal camera, the space between the pine trees began to warp and bend violently, rippling like a liquid mirror out of the empty air. For distinct, broad-shouldered humanoid forms began to materialize. They stood easily 7 feet tall, completely translucent like active military optical camouflage, their outlines bending the light and refracting geometry of the forest behind them. They moved with a slow, terrifyingly fluid quality, their faceless heads all turning slowly toward the obsidian mirror frame. And sitting right in the center of the charcoal-burned circle of snow between those translucent entities was Samuel. The missing boy was completely uninjured, but his eyes were wide, bloodshot, and staring blankly into the smoky glass of the mirror, his body locked in a rigid, catatonic state. Before I could even lunge forward to grab the child, the low-frequency hum of the gorge spiked into a deafening roar. The digital clock on my tactical wristwatch glitched violently, the numbers rolling backward rapidly before freezing into solid blocks of light. The pale green light from the mirror expanded into a massive, blinding field, revealing a tall, featureless silhouette rising from the gray fog, an entity the local shortwave radio forums had whispered about for years, the primary controller of the valley. 3 brilliant glowing dots arranged in a perfect upward triangle flared with absolute brilliance on its brow. I didn't stop to analyze the science of perimeter. I fired 3 rounds from my service weapon directly into the distorted space around the mirror, grabbed Samuel by the collar of his winter coat, and violently dragged his stiff, frozen body away from the chemical hole. We sprinted blindly up the steep, snow-covered slope of the gorge, the terrifying sound of the tree knocking following us effortlessly on either side of the timberline. Every 10 seconds, the heavy cracks would echo through the branches, driving us like cattle toward the outer boundary. We ran until our lungs burned from the acrid smoke, tumbling out onto the shoulder of the main state highway just as the headlights of a massive, unmarked white transport convoy illuminated the dark asphalt. We had broken to the boundary line, but the architects of the Glimmerman perimeter were already waiting in the shadows to reclaim the data, and the final phase of the scrub was about to close around us. My name is Robert, and this is the final log entry in the Blackwood, Maryland archive. If Julian's discovery at the auction house exposed the institutional cover-up, and if Sarah's burning home proved the target testing of innocent citizens, then what happened on the asphalt of that state highway was the absolute, crushing reality of how the sovereign cult operates. When I broke through the timberline of the national forest, dragging the frozen, catatonic body of 7-year-old Samuel into the harsh glare of the high beams, I genuinely believed the nightmare was over. I thought the flashing lights belonged to the state police or the county rescue squads. But as my eyes adjusted to blinding illumination, my heart dropped into a hollow pit of absolute despair. The vehicles waiting on the shoulder of the highway weren't emergency response units. They were 3 massive unmarked white transport vans and a heavy flatbed utility truck equipped with a hydraulic industrial hoist, completely blocking the lanes. Standing in the freezing rain next to the running engines were 6 plainclothes men wearing dark, tailored suits and matching gray canvas tactical gear. They didn't draw weapons, and they didn't offer any medical assistance to the shivering, non-responsive child clutched against my chest. They moved with a cold, synchronized military precision, instantly flanking Samuel and me before the sound of the mountain wind could even carry my voice. The older man in the lead suit stepped forward, his eyes entirely dead, flat, and clinical, reflecting the sterile white glare of the headlights like polished stones. He didn't ask for a Ranger report, nor did he look surprised by the acrid, melting chemical polymer odor caked onto my uniform. "Hand the acid over, Ranger Robert," he said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, professional undertone that cut right through the freezing rain. "You have performed an exceptional service tracking the subject of the boundary line, but your involvement with the perimeter protocol terminates right here. The Vanguard Horizons Group will assume full custody of the child and the biological metrics from this sector. The boy needs an emergency medical clearance at the County Trauma Center." I yelled, my hand tightening instinctively around my service weapon as pure, primal survival panic flared in my chest. His brain is completely locked up, his cells are burning, and there are things, translucent entities pacing to the timber lines right behind us. The valley is compromised. The older suit didn't blink. He slowly reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a thick stack of legal non-disclosure agreements, and pushed a pre-printed copy of the local morning newspaper section directly in front of my face. Samuel was found 3 hours ago by a standard search crew on the public trails, fully conscious and uninjured. The suit whispered, his jaw set in a rigid line. He is currently resting safely at home with his parents. The child you are holding does not exist on the public record. If you do not sign these documents, accept the private retirement grant, and surrender the logbooks immediately, you will be classified as a domestic insurgent under federal security exemptions. You will be scrubbed from the system. Robert, your career, your pension, and your physical record will be erased within 48 hours. They had mapped out the entire narrative before the snow in the Sandstone Gorge had even finished melting. They had a psychological proxy ready to replace the missing child to prevent a public inquiry. While the suits kept me isolated on the highway shoulder, the crew on the flatbed truck was already operating the hydraulic hoist, lifting the pristine, untouched obsidian mirror frame straight out of the sandstone clearing and strapping it down under heavy black plastic sheets. I signed the papers. I had no other choice. I was a lone wilderness ranger facing an invisible multi-billion-dollar wall of corporate and executive power that could rewrite reality itself. I was forced out of Forest Service within a month. My logs confiscated, my years of service reduced to a forced medical discharge due to severe, high-altitude exposure and vivid sensory hallucinations brought on by the winter storm front. I packed my belongings, abandoned my cabin on the ridge, and spent the next year traveling across state lines. Try my absolute best to pretend that the rising and falling wail of that mechanical air raid siren wasn't constantly echoing in the back of my mind. The breakthrough didn't happen until early 2026. Through an encrypted, decentralized archiving network dedicated to cross-referencing unexplained missing persons reports in the national parks, I stumbled across a massive three-part leaked document compiled by three independent individuals: Julian, the journalist from Pennsylvania; Sarah, the photographer from the Maryland Valley; and Marcus, the psychiatric nurse from New York. As we secretly combine our first-hand accounts through secure shortwave frequencies, the final, terrifying blueprint of the Vanguard Horizons group locked into place with a horrifying, absolute clarity. The dementia Marcus treated at the concrete facility, the spontaneous green fires that consumed Sarah's historic home, and the translucent figures I witnessed in the Sandstone Gorge were all interconnected components of a global, weaponized environmental network. The technology, codenamed Operation Glimmerman, bends light and refracts solid matter by violently manipulating the local space-time coordinates. The 2-inch circular indentations burned into the oak floors of Room 9, carved into the obsidian stone frame, and glazed into the bedrock of the forest floorboards weren't random markings. They were physical geometric calibration points. They were hardware nodes used by the corporate handlers to tune the camouflage matrix of the translucent mannequins. The entity we encountered, the primary controller with the 3 brilliant glowing dots arranged in a perfect upward triangle on its brow, is what the inner circles of the syndicate refer to as the 3-dotted goddess. It is not a mythical cryptid, and it is not a traditional supernatural spirit. It is an artificial, high-frequency spatial anomaly generated by the Obsidian Mirror Array. The Vanguard Horizons group is systematically utilizing the isolated national parks and protected wilderness boundaries of the United States as active, unrestricted testing fields, using the transient populations and unsuspecting homeowners as biological baseline filters to measure how the human brain unravels under prolonged spatial radiation. We are all older individuals now, scattered across different states under constant surveillance, but we are no longer keeping quiet. The non-disclosure agreements we sign carry zero weight against the moral obligation we have to warn the public before the grid closes permanently. The reason we are releasing this comprehensive archive is because the framework is still completely operational, expanding its boundaries every single year. The thousands of unexplained disappearances reported annually under the missing 411 parameters, healthy hikers who vanish without a trace near deep cave networks, internal flumes, and remote water sources are the ongoing casualties of the systematic harvest. The authorities will always provide a comfortable, mundane lie to the media. They will blame the wild predators, the sudden shifts in weather, or the mental instability of the victims to keep the public from looking at the corporate footprint in the timberlands. This final part of our warning isn't written to cause panic. It is written to keep you alive when you step outside the boundaries of civilization. If you ever find yourself driving or hiking through a remote national forest sector, and you realize the natural ambient sounds of the wilderness have suddenly dropped into a dead, suffocating silence, do not ignore it. If you check your digital watch or your cell phone and notice the timecode is rapidly glitching backward, while a heavy, acrid gray fog that smells of melting plastic begins to roll down from the upper ridges, do not stop to investigate. And if, underneath the quiet rustle of the pine canopy, you hear 6 sharp, rhythmic tree-knocking sounds echoing directly above you, followed by the distant, mechanical wail of a fading air raid siren, slam your foot on the gas, run toward the nearest public highway, and pray to whatever universe you believe in that you can break through the boundary line before the green light starts to pulse. Because out there in the unmapped valleys, the experiment is still entirely active. The translucent mannequins are still pacing through the trees, dripping the gray fire that burns the earth. And the corporate architects, they are always tracking the next baseline entry to drag into static. Stay safe out there, friends, and never stop speaking the truth, no matter how loud the silence tries to get.